the West, right across the board, from the US to all across the EU, and you've also got, Council of Europe giving its legal opinion. Everyone has told Georgian Dream not to oppose this bill. There's threats to sanctions, and the answer seems to be, we don't care, bring it on.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Anna Hickey, Associate Editor for Communications, with Thomas de Waal, Senior Fellow at Carnegie Europe.
I guess these are people who've grown up in a basically free democratic Georgia, and they kind of smell authoritarian rule in the air under Georgian Dream, because this bill is just one of many measures that they've taken which are rolling back democracy.
Today, we're talking about the foreign agent legislation recently passed by the Georgian parliament and the democratic backsliding occurring across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. On May 14th, the Georgian parliament passed a controversial foreign agent bill titled Transparency of Foreign Influence. Tom, what exactly was in this bill?
Well, this bill is a weapon, you might say, by the Georgian government against non-governmental organizations, but particularly against Western-funded non-governmental organizations, NGOs, civil society, however you like to call them, in Georgia. So it's directed against them, and it's clearly directed against the West, the US and the European Union, and their policies in Georgia. What's in the bill specifically? Well, it says that any organization which gets more than 20% of its funding from foreign sources, and that means pretty much all of them, because Georgia is a pretty low-income country, are subject to heavy scrutiny, reporting requirements, and if they don't meet those reporting requirements, they're going to be hit with heavy fines and face potential closure. And there's a lot of discretion in this bill, which means that it's pretty much up to the Interior Ministry security forces to decide who they want to go after. So it's a bill which, pretends to be about transparency, but is really about threats, you might say, against this whole set of non-governmental organizations. And I guess why them? Because, and we can obviously talk about that a bit more, because there is not so much of a political opposition in Georgia which calls the government to account. These kind of organizations, whether they be independent media, anti-corruption, election monitoring, and a whole host of other things, are the ones which really are kind of the main checks and balances in the Georgian political system.
And so the majority party in the parliament right now is the Georgian Dream. Do I have that right?
That's correct, yes.
And when did they win their election to become the majority party in the parliament? And do they have an election coming up? Why now are they trying to go after these NGOs and organizations that are trying to hold the government accountable?
Yeah, well, obviously, to answer that question, you need to go quite a way back in the history of Georgia post-independence. But, there is an election coming up in October. If Georgian Dream wins that election, it wins an unprecedented fourth term in Georgia as the ruling party. No party has ever managed to do that in Georgia. Georgia's a democracy, but a flawed democracy where it's a bit of a winner-takes-all kind of electoral system. Georgian Dream, voters have lost their enthusiasm for this party, which first came into office in 2012. It's changed a lot since then. So it's very much about leveling the field of opposition, which eases their path to victory in a fourth term. That's part of it. Part of it is obviously the geopolitical context in which this is a party which has traditionally balanced, navigated, like a lot of regimes in this part of the world. They haven't put all their eggs totally in the Western basket. They're formally committed to joining the European Union, and they've often had a great relationship with the United States, but they've also done a lot of business with Russia, and the dial has very, very much turned away from the West by Georgian Dream. So this is the geopolitical context. They look at Ukraine. They don't want to be part of the war in Ukraine. And so they're no longer putting their bets on the West in a way that a Georgian government would have until recently.
And some have called this bill like a Russian law. There are in other post-Soviet states and kind of like Russian allied countries in Eastern Europe, there are similar pieces of legislation like this foreign agent bill, and obviously in Russia as well. Does it seem like there was a push by Vladimir Putin and by like Russian political diplomats to pass this bill? Or is this something the prime minister and the Georgian Dream seemingly did by themselves?
If there is a Russian hand, it's not out there in the open. It's something behind the scenes, something indirect. I would call it a Russian-inspired bill rather than a Russian-instructed bill. You mentioned that there are a number of countries who passed legislation like this. Russia obviously set the scene. They were the first ones to do it back in 2012, kind of deliberately using this language of foreign agents to try and portray these kind of NGOs, these civil society organizations as a kind of fifth column within the country trying to overthrow the state. So that was very much the Russian language there, and obviously borrowed on, Soviet communist rhetoric about traitors and subversion and foreign agents and so on. Other countries have picked that up, as you say, Kyrgyzstan over in Central Asia, Azerbaijan. Also Hungary. Hungary has a sovereignty law, which is also uses the same kind of language. And Hungary is not uncoincidentally is Georgia's best friend within the European Union. This is Viktor Orban's Hungary, which is this super conservative, the most pro-Russian country within the EU. So this is a group of countries which are not formally aligned with Russia. Hungary is formally, obviously, within the EU and NATO, but they kind of signal to Russia, they do business with Russia. So this is I would say, the kind of club of countries that Georgian Dream wants to put Georgia in, to be friendlier to Russia, but not necessarily to kind of sign up completely with Russia.
You mentioned that in the 4 election cycles that the Georgian Dream has succeeded in, the party has changed a lot. When it started out winning elections, did it start out as a much more pro-EU, pro-US party and then has seen a change?
Well, in 2012, if we go back to 2012, we had Mikhail Saakashvili, who listeners may remember, who was the extremely pro-Western president of Georgia. He was president of Georgia when in the war with Russia in 2008, kind of pro-Western, but also increasingly undemocratic, increasingly eccentric, had really kind of lost touch with the public. A lot of people across the political spectrum in Georgia were fed up with him. They wanted to change. So they got behind Georgian Dream, which is a very bizarre project. It's a bit hard to sum up. It was led by this reclusive billionaire, Bidzina Ivanishvili, who came from a Georgian village, made billions in Russia, and then went back to Georgia. And he was the only man with the kind of independent, the financial firepower, the billions to actually take on Saakashvili. So a lot of people, when he decided to go into politics, a lot of people got behind him. But it was never quite clear what he stood for. It was more what he stood against. And that was Saakashvili. So a lot of people, there was a broad coalition and alliance of people who wanted Saakashvili out. Georgian Dream formed that alliance. The name, incidentally, and this, it gets pretty bizarre, this story comes from a rap song named, which was the rap song of Ivanishvili's son, Bera, which you can find out there on YouTube. So it was pretty much, it was clear what they were against, much less clear what they were for, but it was the first term in particular was very pro-European, democratic. They got a lot of stuff done with the EU. They signed the association agreement. But, as time has gone on, the most progressive figures left that coalition, and it just became more and more a kind of inner core of people who are personally associated with Ivanishvili. So the prime minister had no job, for example, before he worked in, Ivanishvili's bank. That the interior minister used to be head of Ivanishvili's bodyguard. So we're down to the bare bones of that inner core. So it's become increasingly anti-Western and increasingly associated with the kind of business interest of one guy, and that's really also a separate part of the story. The future of Georgia is now heavily bound up with the personal business interests of the founder of Georgian Dream.
As different politicians have left Georgian Dream, as it seems to have coalesced around this one eccentric billionaire, have they created any powerful opposition parties? Or is it still really just the Georgian Dream that is the main party in parliament?
The short answer is no. There is no really powerful opposition. There are a lot of people, including a couple of former Georgian Dream prime ministers out there, including incidentally the president. The president in Georgia is not a very powerful figure. He's more of a kind of honorary head of state, but she's very strongly against what's going on. She used to be Georgian Dream herself. So yeah, there's powerful popular individuals, but there's no strong party structure in Georgia. There's only really two parties, Georgian Dream and the former ruling party of Saakashvili. And this is part of the problem, is you've got this kind of rather strange landscape in which it's not clear who people can vote for. So the mass opposition that you've seen out there on your TV sets against this law, is tens of thousands of young people out in the streets. They're basically not party affiliated. They're basically self-organized. It's young people using Facebook and other social media or just university, college networks to get people out. It's not a very structured opposition process. It's very self-mobilized.
What has the reaction been? So you've mentioned that there's been these widespread protests, but that they've been pretty decentralized. And so has there been any figure that has stepped up? Like, you said the president has kind of moved further away from the Georgian Dream.
No, she's pretty outspoken. I don't think, she's not someone who's going to be the next leader. But she's an important figurehead. But the short answer is there is no single leader. This is very much a decentralized, particularly led by young people, by students who've grown up. I guess these are people who've grown up in a basically free democratic Georgia, and they kind of smell authoritarian rule in the air under Georgian Dream, because this bill is just one of many measures that they've taken which are rolling back democracy. But they don't necessarily identify with any particular political party.
In spite of all of this opposition, what is the current status of this bill? Is it enacted yet? Like, where are we at?
So this bill is, about to become law. The Georgian Dream parliamentary group is held together, and they have stuck together. They seem personally loyal to Mr. Ivanishvili. The West, right across the board, from the US to all across the EU, and you've also got Council of Europe giving its legal opinion. Everyone has told Georgian Dream not to oppose this bill. There's threats of sanctions, and the answer seems to be, we don't care, bring it on. It's almost as though they deliberately want to have this fight with the West. They want to prove that the West is out to get them. So that's the context in which there seems to be absolutely no turning back.
In the United States, if Congress or, government passed a bill that citizens found to be unconstitutional, it could be contested in, the court system through the Supreme Court. Is there a mechanism for that in Georgia? And if there's not, is there anything these people protesting on the streets can do to push back against this law once it's passed, other than trying to vote them out in October?
Basically, it's a matter of trying to vote them out in October. And I guess why this is so dangerous is October is obviously still a few months away. People are very angry out on the street, and the government is cracking down. It's a lot of police brutality, intimidation of protesters, civic activists, opposition politicians. So, there's no de-escalation by the government, and the protesters absolutely don't want this to happen. And, there's no court in Georgia which is going to vote this down either.
And you mentioned the repression that some of these protesters have faced. Have there been similar wide-scale protests against legislation the Georgian Dream has passed? Like, has there been similar public outcry and then this very, very harsh police response, or is this a new turning point?
I think this is a turning point. Georgia, because the political system is kind of quite immature, so we say it does a lot of its politics out on the street. There was the Rose Revolution in 2003, where there was a contested election, which the election seemed to be stolen, and hundreds of thousands of people came out on the street, and the then president, caved. He gave in, and there were new elections. There've been a lot of street protests since then. It was a year ago that the Georgian Dream first started to try and enact this law, and then they backed down after a lot of street protests, that they've returned to it. So yes, there is this history of street protest, but I would say this is something different in Georgia and more dangerous because you do have this absolute no compromise attitude from the government. You see police violence, and you see this kind of citizenry trying to overturn it. And those with longer memories would recall that back in the early 90s there was basically a civil war in Georgia in 1992, when Georgia's disastrous first very nationalist president Zviad Gamskhurdia, was very repressive. The fighting broke out, and there were armed groups who overthrew him, and there was a kind of long-running civil war in Georgia. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be repeated. You don't have paramilitary armed groups in the way you would have had in Georgia with the breakup of the Soviet Union. But I would say, the risk of some kind of violence, unfortunately, does grow the longer the standoff continues.
And then kind of using this law to look at Georgian democracy as a whole, how has it been faring since, the Russian invasion of Ukraine? And obviously, Georgia has a couple regions in the country that Russian forces have been occupying. How is, in general, Georgian democracy doing in 2024?
Well, I think, Georgian democracy is not in great shape. And that's mainly because you've had one party in power too long, trying to cling on to power, and the funder and the main funder and head of this party is, I would use the word paranoid. He thinks that the West is after him, and he thinks the West is after his money. I think they're a very key part of it. So that's one reason why Georgian democracy, is in retreat. But to be sure, there are a lot of people who want to stand up for Georgian democracy, and particularly younger people and people and urban people out there in the capital, Tbilisi, so who are prepared to fight for Georgian democracy. So that's, I guess, the domestic side of it. The war in Ukraine obviously complicates things because people are afraid of what Russia does, and I guess there are two views in the country. One is, we support Ukraine, we go west, we put eggs very much in the Western basket here. This is a fight for European democracy, and I guess that's what a lot of the protesters would think. And the second one is, no, in this situation, we stay out of the war, we keep our heads down, we deal with Russia. We can also, by the way, make quite a bit of money with Russia because all of these frontline states are suddenly the new big trading partners of Russia because of Western sanctions. So and Georgian Dream is very much in the second camp here, and about half the time their message is, there is a so-called global party of war. They've used this phrase, which wants to drag us into war with Russia, and we are the party who is stopping that.
You also mentioned that Georgia has obviously historically been interested in joining the EU. Has the EU said anything like, if you pass this piece of legislation, we won't have an accession agreement with you, or are they not quite going that far yet?
Yeah, well, this is the other quite bizarre thing. At the end of last year, the EU did give candidate status to Georgia, thereby sort of starting it on the track to acceptance to the EU. It's still a couple of steps behind Ukraine and Moldova, which further ahead in this process. But Georgia was very much the third member of that trio with a European Union membership perspective, something which really would have been unthinkable 2 or 3 years ago. But obviously the war in Ukraine has changed everything. So the EU, you would have thought had quite a lot of leverage here. And, all the EU leaders, officials are saying, don't pass this law. It contradicts your European ambitions. But what they actually do is a bit less clear. There's a bit of a ... there. And, do they freeze the accession process? Do they try and do sanctions? Here, the trouble is the EU is very much hamstrung by unanimity principle. And you have 2 or 3 countries, but Hungary being the most obvious one, but maybe some others are hiding behind Hungary, which are quite friendly towards this government and, might veto any kind of negative step towards Georgia. So you've got a kind of lot of rhetoric coming out of the EU and not much action. The US is being much more forthright. The US is talking about sanctions, but the US is less of a player now than the EU is in Georgia because of this whole, membership issue.
Kind of narrowing down on, I think some has called it the Hungary problem in the EU, with the unanimity potentially keeping the EU from enacting any stronger sanctions or rules against Georgia if they do pass this piece of legislation. Is there anything, if and when Georgia passes this foreign agent law, is there anything the EU could do without unanimity? Like, could the EU Parliament pass anything other than just a strongly worded, mandamus saying you shouldn't do this? Or because of the unanimity, it's really just too hard for the EU to do anything with actual consequences?
Well, I guess a couple of things to say here. One is that the EU, no one thinks that candidate status accession talks are going to carry on in this environment. So even if they don't formally freeze it, everyone knows that coming into the election, relations with the EU are in a nosedive, and things are pretty bad. So even if they don't formally freeze things, the message will still be clear that the EU is not taking this any further at the moment, and that will be an issue in the election. I guess the second thing is member states can still pursue sanctions even if the EU as a whole doesn't, and it'll be interesting to see how some of the bigger EU member states, like France or Germany, if they do feel held by Hungary, they could go it alone.
This October, looking ahead to this fall, other than this foreign agent law, what else is at the forefront of this election cycle? Is it really just EU relations and then this foreign agent law, or are there other things going on in Georgia that are on the top of people's minds heading into elections this fall? Though, of course, they probably aren't thinking about elections yet because most countries in Europe don't have quite the American lengthiness of their election process.
Sure. Well, I guess people are thinking about elections in Georgia because a lot of people are thinking, how on earth is this going to end? And maybe elections is the only way to get this off the street and avoid violence. But yeah, for sure. I think like a lot of European countries, Georgia has a bit of an urban-rural divide, with the urban professionals who think this is about democracy, this is about our future in Europe, and the foreign agent law is just one of many pieces of legislation that people are worried about. They're also worried about what Georgian Dream has done to the court system and many other things. And I guess then you've got the rural voters who are more worried about, who very low income in many cases, only earning a few $100s equivalent a month. They're obviously more worried about socio-economic issues. They're more, wouldn't say politically friendly to Russia, but they're probably happy at increased trade with Russia because particularly, the Russian market is still a traditional destination for a lot of Georgia's agricultural goods, and it's wine, which, more than half of Georgian wine still goes to Russia, for example, and wine's quite a big deal in Georgia. So it's a bit hard to generalize, but I think for sure, Georgian Dream came to power like a lot of these, parties promising cure poverty and unemployment and, and do a lot of stuff which it simply hasn't. So I think one reason that I guess that they're worried is that they probably see that they probably did their own private polling and realized that they're not as popular as they used to be, and the tactic is not so much to, do something positive as to do something negative. It's basically to clear the whole field of opposition.
And then is there anything you're specifically watching to keep an eye on for just general Georgian democracy? Are there any figures that you're keeping an eye on of maybe they could start a party in opposition to the Georgian Dream, or is it all kind of too much of a moving situation to really have any idea what's going to happen in the coming weeks and months?
I think in these coming elections, it's going to be a proportional system. You need to get 5% of the vote to get into parliament. So I guess the Georgia watchers are watching a few individuals who I think are capable of getting 5% of the vote and what they're up to, and hopefully they're doing some coalition building and some bridge building with other politicians. So that's going on. But I guess, the big picture here is how spectacular this kind of descent into this retreat from democracy is. It's all happened in a couple of months. Even a couple of months ago, there were fairly normal discussions between Georgian Dream and the EU. And now just the speeches they give are just, it's conspiracy theory land. It's some of these, Marjorie Allen Green land, if you want to put it like that. It's from the other Georgia, by the way. So in which they're talking about, Soros, or even the Freemasons have come up, or, that the Council of Europe Venice Commission is actually against us, and that the West is plotting revolution. The rhetoric is pretty extreme. And so when you're dealing with a government like that, it's quite hard to know how to react. And this is why you see this kind of fairly panicked reaction from Western officials who thought they had the fairly normal and sane interlocutors only 2 or 3 months ago, and now wondering what the hell has happened here.
And this question may just be because, as an American, I view foreign policy from an extremely Americanized lens. But would there be any credence to the idea that other countries, like Georgian officials, would see a potentiality of Donald Trump regaining the presidency in America, and that then making this, America with all of its power in Europe more friendly towards Russia? So they're trying to rush this bill in before the elections, and then, assuming that if Trump wins, they won't face these sanctions or repercussions? Or is Georgia a little bit too isolated and, as you were saying, not as reliant on America, that's not as much as a factor in their thinking?
That's a really interesting one. A couple of months ago, the Prime Minister, Irakli Kobakidze, he went to the CPAC convention in Budapest, hosted by Viktor Orban, which is, this ultra-conservative group. Incidentally, this Georgian Dream used to be affiliated with the kind of centre-left socialists in the European Parliament, and now it suddenly lurched to the far right, which tells you a bit about how weird this party is. So I guess, in Budapest, he would have hung out with some of these kind of trumpets from the right of the Republican Party, and maybe got some encouragement from them because part of this is also this family values, so-called anti-LGBT kind of agenda that they're also pushing. So, yeah, I think the Georgian government is one of several governments around the world, probably Turkey, Hungary, Serbia, Azerbaijan, are all looking and thinking that if Trump gets back in the US, it's going to be a much more friendly international environment for them. Whether that's just part of a big consideration, somewhat just part of the kind of general weather, it's a bit harder to say.
And then also thinking towards the elections this fall, if this piece of legislation is enacted, what is going to be the effects on the possibility of a free and fair and nonviolent election in October? How important are these NGOs to supporting elections?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a critical point. So you've got several kind of independent media organizations which may be facing closure or heavy fines if this law goes through, and you've got election monitoring organizations as well. I mean, I also haven't mentioned, I mean, there are thousands of other organizations in Georgia, who do things like, disability rights. There's a case of a Tbilisi dog shelter which says they might have to close if this law goes through. But, maybe that's just collateral damage as far as the ruling party is concerned. The ones they really want to go after are these kind of scrutinizing organizations. And, and for sure, this, I think what Georgian Dream would like to have is one of these kind of non-election elections that you see across, much of the post-Soviet states, like in Russia. I don't think it'd be quite as bad as Russia, but that's maybe what they aspire to, where they control the media, they're in control of the process, and there's falsification, then there's no one around really to see it.
Is there anything that just regular citizens either in Europe and America can do to support, the protesters, or is this really just the protesters in Georgia are going to try to prevent this, piece of legislation from being enacted, and if they can't, they're going to go to the ballot box this fall?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much that. I think they've got a lot of support, and also I guess Western politicians have to be a little careful, because it looks like Mr. Ivanishvili and his team are quite paranoid. They do think the West is out to get them. So if the Western politicians, are too active in supporting the free protest, that kind of confirms their conspiracy theories as well. So you have to be a little careful. I think it's important to be talking about elections and not regime change. And, it's going to be hard for Georgian Dream to retreat on the law, but they could at least, come under pressure, to bring forward elections, and to accept that they have to have an open election. I mean, I think that's probably where the pressure is best applied, to be honest.
How effective do you think the EU and US have been so far in their response? And is there anything that you think the governments should be doing in response, or is it all just hope for the best?
Well, I mean, I can't really say, because a lot is going on behind the scenes, and clearly, one reason Mr. Ivanishvili is paranoid is because, he could face asset freezes. One reason he's paranoid, in fact, is that Credit Suisse, a couple of years ago, the Swiss bank he was in a lawsuit with, and he actually probably had a fairly good case against them, have basically frozen a lot of his assets and kind of used the war in Ukraine as an excuse to do that. So there are vulnerabilities, and I'm guessing that some of the stuff going on behind the scenes is focused on that kind of stuff, sanctions, money issues, asset freezes that we're just not seeing.
And then before we kind of wrap up our conversation, do you have any final thoughts about the, democracy in Georgia or in Eastern Europe in general, and kind of how that part of the world is doing and progressing right now?
Yeah, well, I think Georgia, it's a bit of a weather vane here. I think I see it, and the war in Ukraine is obviously absolutely crucial here. When Ukraine was doing well in the war, people were seeing it, as a hopeful sign for, democracy in Eastern Europe. And now that the Russians are, pursuing their counteroffensive, and the Russians seem to be on the up, we're seeing, the wind blowing in the opposite direction. I mean, I think there are some one-party states, like in Central Asia or Azerbaijan, who are authoritarian. They're very good at doing business with Russia. They keep their relations with the West, but they don't cross Russia's red line. Very much kind of regime to regime negotiations, and the people are left out of it. What the people want is secondary, and those states are doing absolutely fine because I don't think they're under imminent threat from Russia. They're not going to join NATO. They have some Western support for their sovereignty. So, and then you've got democracies, and I'm thinking of Moldova and Armenia, where it's a whole different picture. That their relations with Russia are breaking down. They want to go west, and what the people says matters. They're not going to do a deal. They can't do a deal, even if they wanted to, with Russia over the people's heads. And Armenia is particularly problematic case because it's a country which formerly allied with Russia, but now has a pro-Western government wants to change its orientation. Georgia, this is a bit of a long introduction to say, make the point that Georgia is in the middle there. Georgia is a kind of swing state here, I guess, as the other Georgia is in the US. It's kind of, its government wants to be one of those one-party states to do a deal with Russia, and the people want to be like Moldova and Armenia. They want to be more democratic. They want to move towards Europe. So what happens in Georgia, for sure, matters more than in just Georgia.
And I think we will leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. The podcast is edited by Jen Pacha, and your audio engineer this episode was Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo. Our theme song is from Alibi Music. As always, thank you for listening.